What is up, everyone? So, Pro Tour Eldritch Moon happened last weekend. This guy happened last weekend. And a lot of turns were taken. So, this is the deck that Owen Turtenwald made the finals of the Pro Tour with. I actually ended up playing this deck in SCG Regionals also because it looks so sweet. And started 3-0, then the wheels kind of fell off. But, you know, what are you going to do, right? So this deck, and basically a lot of decks of the Pro Tour actually, look very different from the decks I think that people were building leading up to the Pro Tour, and, you know, the decks that people were playing on the Open Series and stuff like that. And, you know, these people are professionals, you know, they do this for a living, and they happen to build good decks, so imagine that. But this deck uses a bunch of self-mill stuff: Vessel of Nascency, Grapple with the Past, Gather the Pack. Basically just fill your graveyard for Emrakul. Deck has a lot of different card types. There are some artifacts in Pilgrim's Eye, Corrupted Graphstone, and a Singleton Miser's Planeswalker in Chandra, which the mana base is kind of stretched a little bit to accommodate, but I like it. If you can get Emrakul to cost 6 mana, that's a hell of a deal. Most of the time, though, the Planeswalker is just going to be like your wild card. Like, maybe you're missing enchantment, maybe you're missing artifact, but the Planeswalker is just like a random extra hit for like each of those card types, basically. It's basically just like the Joker in the deck, but sometimes, you know, you do actually hit all 7, and it's great. So the one Chandra is thin value for sure, but I do like it. I think it's really good. So other than ramping to Emrakul, there's also some cool stuff going on. There are some Gnarlwood Dryads. I keep saying this Gnarlroot. I don't know why, but Gnarlwood Dryad basically just has the Typhoid Rats against creature decks like Bane Company. And it is sweet that you basically get to play Gather the Pack in a deck that doesn't want to play a bunch of creatures, because you have things like Gnarlwood Dryad that kind of function as like your Terminates. So Gather the Pack actually has a little bit of added utility there, because you can actually find sort of a removal spell off it, which is pretty nice. Plus, the Dryad is another thing to emerge with Elder Deep Fiend and Wretched Griff, which is pretty sweet. So it doesn't make the Deep Fiend cost all that much cheaper, but certainly making it be 6 mana instead of 8 mana is kind of a big deal. So I do like the Dryads. I think the Dryad Gather the Pack thing is just like a very, very clever innovation. Then there's also some Pilgrim's Eyes. These are artifacts for your real Delirium and your fake Emrakul Delirium, but it's also a creature you can emerge with Deep Fiend. It's one of the reasons why you get to play pretty much a low land count. I would say that 21 is pretty low. And yeah, it's pretty nice. Then we have some K-Returns. Emrakul K-Return is basically just the goddamn. It is like... a lot of my testing with Emrakul was like, okay, this card is obviously very good. I know that my deck is not built 100% correctly because I'm like casting Emrakul and still losing like some of the time. But my Emrakul decks did not have Kozilek's Return, and I think that's it. That's the key right there. So if you get to cast Emrakul and also use the pseudo flashback on Kozilek's Return, then it's going to be really tough for your Emrakul to not actually win you the game. So that's kind of the goal of the deck. But you can't necessarily Emrakul every single game. Sometimes your opponent is a little too fast for you. Maybe your draw is not great. Emrakul ends up like costing 8 because you have like some bad self-mill stuff. And it's just like a little too expensive. And that's why the Deep Fiends and the Wretched Griff are in the deck. So you have a lot of ways to actually flashback the Kozilek's Return and stabilize. And then hopefully that buys you the time to actually get to Emrakul. So it is pretty sweet. This deck has a lot of synergy going on. The key card probably is Nissa's Pilgrimage. I think 7 Forests is a little on the low end, but like I said, you kind of need the game trails to make Chandra Flamecaller castable, at least the majority of the time. But Pilgrimage is definitely the card where not only are you almost always going to have Spell Mastery, but it also just makes it so you have no trouble hitting land drops, even though you only have 21 lands in your deck. And you have 21 lands, you're casting Pilgrimage, you have 3 in play, so you have 18 left. This is going to get 2 or 3 more, and you're not going to have many lands left in your deck either. So then you're kind of just drawing gas at that point, which is pretty nice. And then I like the Ishkanaz. I think this is kind of the gap. Like you start, or it's what bridges the gap rather. You start with Gnarlwood Dryad, right? And this slows them down a little bit. Your end game is Emrakul the Promised End, and Ishkana is just there to make, turns 4 through 7 like very hard for your opponent to get through and kill you. So it just buys you a ton of time to get to Emrakul, which is pretty nice. So obviously not a ton of synergy with Kozilek's Return, but I do think it bridges the gap, and this deck definitely needed something like that. So I think you could also argue that like Deep Fiend, like a relatively cheap emerged Deep Fiend that flashes back at Kozilek's Return, is also something that helps bridge the gap. So overall, just a very, very well-constructed deck. One thing worth noting is that the Graphstones are basically only going to tap for green, but I think that's acceptable. You could use Hedron Crawler in this spot, but it dies to Kozilek's Return, so I don't really like that very much. So Graphstone is, it's doing its job. It's not flashy, it's not great, but it is pretty solid, and starting on turn 3, you should be able to tap it for mana because you're likely going to have a Vessel, a Grapple, or a Gather. And even if you have like Pilgrimage on 3 after your Graphstone, maybe you can play a Dryad off it, and then you can start using this to actually accelerate you. So that's pretty nice. One thing worth noting from playing the games is that I often wanted a Hedron Archive instead of Graphstone. So maybe that could be a change that people make going forward. As for the sideboard, I think it's a little rough. Basically, Temur colors do not have excellent sideboard options in this format, especially since the red is a splash. I think the deck would prefer to play more early spot removal spells, and it's possible that maybe instead of Fire Impulse, you could play the blue enchantment. I'm forgetting the name, but it has flash, and it gives them minus X, -0 for each card in your graveyard. Like, that could be a removal spell if you're just trying to kill a thing that's dealing you damage. But I think most of the creatures in this format provide enough value that you actually want to kill them outright. Like they're Jaces or they're Duskwatch Recruiters or Spell Quellers or what have you. And you actually just want like a hard removal spell. And unfortunately, red is our splash color. So we can't play too many of these. And then there's some counter spells. Summary Dismissal would not surprise me if there's a second copy of this card in these decks going forward just for the mirror matches. And then there's a Singleton Negate. 2 Invasive Surgeries, which I think is pretty telling as far as the cards that Owen was scared of. He was more scared of like an early Transgress the Mind than anything else, anything like a Planeswalker or what have you. Otherwise, you normally see more negates. A couple Dispels for Bank Company and Control decks that are going to try and like counter your stuff. A couple Jaces and a couple Shaman of Forgotten Ways, basically for a little bit of a transitional sideboard. Like, people are going to look at this deck and be like, the Gnarlwood Dryads are not very good against me, so they'll probably board those out, and then maybe I just need a couple removal spells to beat like Deep Fiend and stuff, so I'm going to board down on removal spells, and then you just bring in things like Jace and Shaman, and just kind of go from there. And Shaman is also pretty nice in that it's very, very powerful in mirror matches, so you might be able to see that there, especially like with this deck specifically taking off, with Owen getting second at the Pro Tour with it, and this deck basically having no way to beat a Shaman. I think Shaman is going to be one of the more popular sideboard cards going forward. The Coax is incredibly clever. I love this. I think it is great. As I was watching the coverage, I wouldn't have been surprised if Owen had like 2 copies of this in a sideboard, but having only 1 is fine. Basically, a lot of people are going to try and Transgress and Infinite Obliteration your Emrakuls, and then eventually you'll just find a Coax, and maybe it's like you mill the Coax off some self-mill stuff, but you actually still have like Jace and the Den Protector to get it back. So pretty clever. Gives you a nice angle against the decks that are doing their best to try and mess with you. And then there's a Miser's Clip Wings, which I think Owen was bringing in against like Mindrack Demon. Like that's what I think he brought this in against Black Green Delirium. I don't know if this is actually a good card to have in the sideboard or not, but that's it. That's the deck. It is kind of tough to imagine how the games are going to play out just by looking at this deck list, because like I said, it is so much different than anything I'm sure that people have seen before, but that's what the videos are for. So let's get to it.